Welcome everyone. This is Unit 2, Institutions of Government. Does government in the US operate the way it should? Let me just go ahead and begin by asking that question because in Unit 2 we're going to be looking at the three branches of government in more detail. In the beginning, we're going to look at Congress, and then we'll turn our attention to the presidency. And last but not least, we'll look at the U.S. Supreme Court and the lower courts and ask really the normative question. Is it functioning the way that the framers intended to function? And we'll do some comparison as we go, learn the basic fundamental characteristics of each branch, and determine whether or not it's, again, working how it's supposed to be intended. So we'll start Unit 2 by starting off with the legislative branch and looking specifically at the United States Congress. And if you think about this question, does Congress represent the American people? It's a controversial one. In theory, Congress is the branch of government where our interests are supposed to be represented. So looking at its structure and how it functions, does it do this? Does it really represent us, the American people, and our interests? And we'll look at this question much more closely, but keep that in the back of your mind as we start looking at the basic structures of Congress. Okay, first what I want us to do is to compare and contrast both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And to begin, before we in fact dive into the formal lecture, I want you folks to draw a Venn diagram on your notes. And if you don't know what a Venn diagram looks like, there it is, two concentric circles intersecting each other. And I want you to label one circle the House of Representatives and the other one the U.S. Senate. And you can, in fact, open your EAG textbook and turn to Chapter 6. And anything goes here. I want you just to juxtapose both chambers in Congress. Identify for me the similarities, the differences. What do they have in common? Again, write that down where the two circles intersect. Anything goes. Powers, qualifications, leadership, anything that you can pull out from your initial reading of Chapter 6. So go ahead and pause this video. Take 2 or 3 minutes, jot down a few ideas, and then we'll come back and see what you come up with. Okay, welcome back. I hope you took the time here to jot down a few ideas, a few characteristics from both chambers. And if we were in class, we'd do this together. We'd come back together in class, and I'd ask you what you came up with. And again, to expedite time here, because we're doing this via YouTube, I've gone ahead and listed down some of the most common characteristics that students in the past have brainstormed. So let me just go ahead and go through the list with you. And it would behoove you to add upon your list, if you didn't brainstorm of these characteristics, to make sure you jot it down on your notes. It's going to help you in the long run. Not to mention for the exam for Unit 2, this will definitely help you um, summarize the important characteristics from both chambers. So I started off by looking at the set terms. How many years do both um, representatives and Congress actually serve? In the U.S. House, as you hopefully now know, they serve for 2-year terms. The Senate serves for 6-year terms. It's interesting to note that Congress does not have what's called term limits, meaning that they can only serve X number of terms, and after they do, they are termed out. In Congress, that does not exist. If you're able to win an election consistently, again and again and again, you can in fact make this into a career. In fact, the longest serving representative was because he stepped down just this past term, the 113th Congress, was Representative John Dingell from the state of Michigan. And John Dingell was in fact elected to the House in 1954. And if you can imagine that, if you do the math, he served quite a few number of years. And just to put that into perspective, Eisenhower was still president when he was elected. So, FYI, no term limits. If you look at the number of representatives in the U.S. House, it's now capped to 435 members. We'll talk about when Congress, in a way, capped that number to 435. We know that in the House of Representatives, they are directly elected by the people. That 435 members is also based on population. If you recall, this was part of the Great Compromise, where large state interests were satisfied under the House of Representatives. And if you look at the Senate, again, it was based on equal representation, satisfying the interest of the states, where we have 2 senators per state, 50 states in the Union for a total of 100 members. Let's just look at qualifications real briefly. If you look at the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Constitution stipulates that they have to be at least 25 years old. And if you think about that, that's not that old. They have to be 7 years a citizen of the United States and be a resident of the state. If you look at the qualifications of the Senate, they tend to be a little bit older. 30 years old, 9 years a citizen, and again, resident of the state as well. If you briefly look at leadership, the leader of the U.S. House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House, and the Speaker is voted on by all 435 members of the House of Representatives. And typically, of course, whoever has the majority, whichever political party has the majority, ultimately, whoever has the majority will become the Speaker of the House. And as we know today, the current Speaker is Speaker John Boehner from Ohio, a Republican. The Senate also has leadership. Sort of interesting here, I want you to understand that the person who actually has power in the Senate is the Senate Majority Leader, and that's Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, also a Republican, since they also have the majority in the Senate. The Vice President, in fact, is the President of the Senate. Now, he doesn't have any formal powers with exception to one, and that is if there is a tie, a 50-50 tie in the Senate, and then the Vice President casts that tie-breaking vote. There is one person I neglected here to put down on the PowerPoint, and that's the Senate Pro Tem. The Senate Pro Tempore is the most senior tenured senator, oftentimes called the Dean of the Senate, and that's currently Senator Patrick Leahy, who holds that position. If you go back to the House of Representatives, what you'll also see, and this is very important for you to note, is that the House is much more specialized than the Senate is, and as such, it has more formal rules. Unlike the Senate, that operates using less formal rules, it's much more collegial, in fact. When the House focuses on domestic policy, as you can see, all money bills must originate in the House. Only makes sense, right? That the power of the purse, the money of the people, is overseen by members of the U.S. House of Representatives, representative of the people. That only makes sense. They focus much more on domestic policy, whereas the Senate focuses much more on foreign policy. Confirmations of appointments are also the realm of the Senate. They usually take also an advisory role, the advice and consent to help the president. And also, important for you to note here, all ratification of treaties also go through the Senate. So what do they have in common? Well, remember that Congress is the lawmaking branch of government. So both the House and the Senate engage in that process, the legislative process, which we'll talk much more about in class. They both share the power to impeach. The House, in fact, indicts, and the Senate tries. They all work using committees. And we'll talk much more about different types of committees and the legislative process later on. They have the power to declare war, which you'll find out Congress has not done since World War II. They are, in fact, both equal in power. When a bill is introduced, it must be passed both by the House and in the Senate. So even though they consist of different numbers, understand that they are equal in power. No one chamber is greater than the other. They have the ability, again, to override a presidential veto by 2/3 vote, as you can see there. And also, which I didn't list down, the amendment process, as we talked about, also requires a 2/3 vote in order to advance the amendment to the states. That again requires 3/4 of the states to ratify. So again, I spend a lot of time on this, but this should help you out moving forward. Now, this is not everything, of course, but does give you an idea of where we're heading in this beginning lecture by looking at the structure of Congress. Okay, let's go ahead and begin. I think you already know, because we covered it in the previous lecture, that Article 1 talks about Congress in the U.S. Constitution. Remember that because of the Great Compromise, as I said, the debate between large versus smaller populated states, ultimately they came to a great compromise, creating a bicameral legislature with two chambers. And the two chambers that they created were the U.S. House of Representatives, that ultimately satisfied the larger states' interests, and the U.S. Senate that became that satisfied smaller states' interests as well. So let me just talk about some of the important characteristics of each chamber before we move forward here. The U.S. House of Representatives, hint, hint, is called the People's Chamber, and I think that's pretty self-evident here because we, the people, elect members of the U.S. House. And if you think about this, folks, they represent really the interests of the majority, right? The House is definitely much more responsive to the interests of their constituents because they are elected re-elected every 2 years. And as such, folks, in theory, in theory here, uh, they would be much more responsive to what the people demand. And if you think about it, that only makes sense. Um, in order to, once they get into office, they have to show their constituents that they're actually doing something, that they're actually moving moving the process along, introducing bills, getting bills passed quickly. Why? Because after that first year, and once they start their second year, really, they're already preparing for re-election. They're awaiting the election, so they're going to have to show their constituents that they deserve to be re-elected. And as such, if you think about this, and in a way I've already mentioned it, they like to use a metaphor here, press the gas. They like to speed up the process, the legislative process. They want to get things done more quickly. They're much more responsive, and as such, they are more responsive to the majority of the people. Um, uh, in theory, if you think about it, if there's a change in popular opinion, the people theoretically can have all of the members of the House of Representatives voted out, and a new slate of 435 members voted in. Now, in theory, of course, that can be done. Of course, we haven't had that done, but again, here, as you can see, it does show you that the people can impact the members of the U.S. House of Representatives, which you'll see much more with much more frequency than the Senate. The number of representatives, again, is dependent on the population. During each census, if California loses people, loses population, there's a possibility that we could also lose a particular representative. And since the number of the House of Representatives is capped at 435, then another state who's gained more people, increased population, may in fact have that seat reapportioned to that particular state. Now, just a note, California hasn't changed at all. California, in fact, has always, ever since it's become a state, has always gained seats, with exception to the last census, where we didn't, in fact, gain a seat, nor did we lose a seat. And FYI, why not? I'll let you know now that of the 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, California has 53 of those representatives, being the largest populated state in the union. So, hint, hint, yeah, I would remember that number. That's going to be important. Moving on, in particular when we look at the Electoral College in Unit 3. We talked about the qualifications of the House. Members in the U.S. House tend to be a little bit younger, but as you can see, the framers outlined specific qualifications. They have to be at least 25 years old, a citizen for 7 years, and a resident of the state. But I would say, even though it's not stipulated in the Constitution, they better be a resident of the congressional district that they're representing. That only, once again, makes sense. People will vote for someone who lives and understands the district, right? It's not going to help anyone or a particular candidate who's running for office if they live in Los Angeles and they decide to run for a congressional seat here in San Joaquin County. People are going to point to the fact that they're out of touch. They really don't know the issues locally, right? So keep and bear that in mind. In order to meet residency, interestingly enough, in the U.S. Constitution, all you need to do is to have your house be in that congressional district, or at least your primary address, to be more accurate. Most members of Congress are affluent. They have multiple homes, but it really depends on where they declare their primary residence is going to be the place where they can run for political office. Um, Someone once asked me, well, what about P.O. boxes, Professor V? That doesn't count. So you actually have to maintain residency and have your primary home address where you receive your mail in that particular congressional district to fulfill that requirement. Okie dokie. Let's move to the Senate chamber. And if you look at the Senate, it is representative of the states. Again, why? It was based on equal representation. Each state, regardless of size, received 2 senators. It used to be under the original Constitution, hint, hint, under the 17th Amendment. The senators were elected by state legislatures. After the 17th Amendment was ratified, the power to elect and select the senators were given directly to the people. So once again, just like the House, they are elected by popular vote. Qualifications. Actually, before we get to qualifications, they do serve a longer term than the House. They're there for 6 years, and as such, they're less responsive to their constituencies, right? They have more time to deliberate. They don't have to face re-election with as much frequency as the U.S. House. So they can moderate the issues. They, in fact, slow down the legislative process, right? I told you that the House loves to press the gas. The Senate, in this case, loves to tap the brakes here and really slow down the process. And if you think about it, if the House represents the majority of the people, the Senate protects minority rights. So here you have, again, that saying of that relates to our government, as I mentioned to you when we were talking about Madison, that our government does what the majority of the people wants them to do while still respecting minority rights. The basic structure of both chambers here attempts to, in a way, reconcile that balance as well. Okay? So, with that said, let's look at powers. In a way, I've already defined for you the Great Compromise. I already talked about the 17th Amendment. Looked at their membership and their selection methods. Let's look at powers. Hint, hint, hint. This is very important. There are 3 types of powers that I want you to know: enumerated, denied, and implied. The first is, let's first look at enumerated. Enumerated powers, simplified. Enumerated is just a fancy word of saying that it's written down. And if you were to go to the U.S. Constitution in Article 1 and try to locate where the enumerated powers of Congress are written down, you would go to Article 1, Section 8. Now that's important for you to write down. Hint, hint. I want you to know that. If you go to Article 1, Section 8, it states, quote, "The Congress shall have the power to, ... and it lists down a set of powers that Congress has the power to do. They're very specific, as you'll see: establish a post office, establish standards, weights, and measures, the ability to collect tax, the power to regulate trade. Again, very, very specific. So that's enumerated. Okay. We already talked about denied powers in the U.S. Constitution lecture. Remember, this is written down in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. And remember, there are four denied powers that we talked about. Congress cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus, nor can they pass bill of attainders, nor can they pass ex post facto laws and titles of nobility, if you recall. So those are the denied powers of Congress. And last but not least, at the end of Article 1, Section 8, there is a clause that says that Congress can, quote, "make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution for the foregoing powers," unquote. That particular clause is known as the implied powers. It is also known by another name called the necessary and proper clause, hint, hint. And essentially what I want you to understand here is that Congress can really do whatever it wants. Let me give you an example. If Congress can borrow money on behalf of the United States, borrow credit on behalf of the United States, and can regulate interstate commerce, can Congress establish a national bank, a central bank? And the answer is yes. Even though it's not written down as part of its enumerated powers, we can imply, right, that it has the powers to do so. And um, this is really interesting because at the end of the day, Congress can do whatever it wants. It can, by virtue of the implied powers. All it has to do is try to justify its actions by justifying it within its enumerated powers. So if that's the case, what I want you to see here is that Congress can virtually do whatever it wants. Whatever Congress passes will always be, hint, hint, it will always be constitutional unless it is deemed unconstitutional by the courts. Okay? So that then begs the question, right? If Congress can do whatever it wants, how then do we ensure that Congress is accountable by not making unjust laws? I would ask you that question in class, and the answer is you and me. We, the people, before Congress can make laws or draft laws or introduce laws or bills, be more specifically, in the legislative process, we the people have to keep them accountable. Now I know we're busy. Once you start your careers, it's you're not going to have time, right, to look over your representatives' shoulders. But if you do, um, if you are successful and you start a career, you'll find out that you'll have interest groups who look after your interests. These are typically lobbying firms. These are typically special interest groups. All right. If you become a lawyer, for example, you'll have the American Bar Association who look after your interests, and they'll be the ones in charge of ensuring that Congress does not introduce any unjust law or law that would harm your interests. If you um, become a doctor, the American Medical Association will look after your interests. If you become part of a union, it's the union's responsibility again to watch over your interests. Okay, so that's how that works. That's how, in a way, we keep them in check. And again, you can also argue that once a bill goes through the process, then of course that can be checked by the two other branches of government, right? The executive and the judiciary. So let me just go back to the point of implied powers here, and once again repeat the fact that whatever Congress does, it's constitutional. And the question then becomes, how then do we bring a bill to the courts if we believe it to be unconstitutional, right? Now, I'm jumping the gun here. We'll talk much more about this once we get to the judiciary, but I think it's important for me to introduce this term now. That term, hint, hint, it's not on the PowerPoint. I would write this up on the board, and I would suggest you write it down on your notes as well. The term is called legal standing. Okay? And what is legal standing? Legal standing ultimately is this idea that you have to show that that specific law that Congress has passed has either caused you harm or will cause you harm before you can bring it up to the courts, or at least before the courts can, again, consider it. And it makes sense, right? You just can't go willy-nilly to the courts and tell the judge, Your Honor, I want this particular law to be deemed unconstitutional. I want it to be repealed. Well, the judge is going to ask you, well, why? And that why question, again, is legal standing. You have to establish standing. You have to show that that particular law has either caused you harm or will cause you harm. Okay? A good example of this would be a few years ago, Congress decided to, the Supreme Court, correct that, the Supreme Court decided to deem unconstitutional the Defense of Marriage Act. And how did this come to be? There was a lesbian couple, an older lesbian couple who's one of them, in fact, died. The other one, when her partner died, left a will, leaving all of the inheritance to her. But because the Defense of Marriage Act only recognized marriage between a man and a woman, the surviving partner was not allowed to receive that inheritance. And of course, she sued. She brought a case up citing that the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, violated her property rights, her legal rights to inherit this property. It went up to the Supreme Court, folks, and clearly she established standing, right, showing that particular law violated her property rights, and the Supreme Court agreed with her, and as such, that law was deemed unconstitutional. Okay, I know we spent a lot of time on that particular slide. That is an important slide. So with that, let's go ahead and move forward here. What I provided here for you is the overview of how Congress operates. We're going to look at 4 questions through this lecture that will, again, hopefully demystify for you how Congress works. And here are the questions. We're going to look at who are the members of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate in much greater detail. We'll look at how Congress is organized to conduct its business, and again, they're organized by committees through committees where they debate the bills, and ultimately how those bills become laws is called the legislative process. And we'll spend a good amount of time looking at that, and I'll be walking you through each step, and in fact, I'll be doing that when I return on Monday. And then last but not least, we're going to look at how Congress checks the executive and the judicial branches. So we'll look at each of these questions. So let's look at the members of Congress. I want you to understand that Congress is made up, in fact, holds its sessions every 2 years. In fact, the very first session of Congress met from 1789 to 1791. That was the very first Congress. And currently today, we are now in the 114th Congress that began this year, and will last until 2016. So the 114th Congress is the Congress from 2015 and 2016. I want to go back, though, and provide you some historical context here of the 111th Congress. The 111th Congress was from 2008 to 2010. And if you recall, at that time, the Democrats swept into power. And this is not a surprise. President Obama, with that historic election, was elected back in 2008. So both the House and the Senate were dominated by Democrats. The Speaker of the House at the time was the very first woman Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from San Francisco. And then you had Senator Harry Reid as the Senate Majority Leader at that time. From 2010 to 2012 was the 112th Congress, and you'll find out that the Democrats lost the House during the midterm elections. I'll be explaining that to you in a moment, primarily because of Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act, because it re-energized the Republicans, particularly the libertarian movement, as we now know today as the Tea Party movement, and the Republicans swept in into the House. The Democrats, however, maintained the control of the Senate. So in the 112th Congress, we did have a divided government, a divided chamber, where the Speaker of the House of Representatives was John Boehner, since the Republicans took over, and the Senate Majority Leader remained Senator Reid, because the Democrats maintained power. In the 113th Congress from 2012 to 2014, things didn't change. President Obama won re-election, closer election. The Republicans here maintained control of the House, and the Democrats here also gained a few more seats, solidifying their majority in the Senate. And of course, the last midterm election that we had last November began the 114th Congress. And here you saw the Republicans essentially take over the Senate, and defeated Democrats. And in a way, you could argue this was a referendum vote on the president as well. So now John Boehner, of course, controls the House of Representatives. The Senate is controlled by, again, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, and they're all pictured right there. So I want you just to focus on not the demographics yet, but the political party affiliation below. This is the 111th Congress, but I want to trace, again, a little bit of political history for you so you know where we're going. Again, the Democrats had a sizable, huge majority, again, because of the election of the president, Barack Obama. They swept into the House, 256 over the Republicans, 179. If you look at the Senate, too, the Democrats had quite a substantial majority as well, 57 Democrats to 41 Republicans, and 2 independents who, again, caucused with the Democrats. So in reality, we had 59 Democrats. In the 112th Congress, look at the breakdown here with political party affiliation. Because of Obamacare and the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which we'll talk much more about during the legislative process, the Republicans swept the House. Nancy Pelosi lost her job as Speaker, had to hand it over to John Boehner, as the Republicans again pummeled the Democrats, 242 to 193 in the House. And as you can see, the Republicans inched closer in the Senate as well, gaining a few seats, 47 to 51. Again, the 2 independents caucus with the Democrats. Okay, if you look at the 113th Congress, things really didn't change too much. Republicans lost a few seats. The Democrats climbed their way back, but again, were not able to retake the majority. The Republicans still had a clear majority in the 113th Congress. The Republicans also lost a few Senate seats as well in the 113th Congress in the 2012 presidential election, general election, 45 to 53. Again, two independents caucusing with the Democrats. Now, this is what we have today. As you can see, some may argue that the midterm election was a referendum on the president, and typically lame duck presidents in their 6th year in office, if you look at the trend, their political party typically loses seats, and that was not out of the ordinary for the Democrats, where Republicans again added on to their majority, sizable lead in the House, 246 to 189, and the Republicans took over the Senate. From the Democrats, 54 to 44, and that's where we stand today. I want to talk a little bit about the demographics here, a little bit. And if you look at the demographics of the 114th Congress, what I have here on the chart, as you can see, are demographics based on age, income, education, gender, ethnicity, and I've categorized it looking at this House and the Senate in comparison with the general public. And I want you guys just to ask yourselves this question: does Congress in fact look like the general public? If you look at age, the House tends to be a little bit younger than the Senate, but they tend to be again much older than the general public. Average age, according to the 2010 census, is roughly 37 years old, almost 38 years old. The income of the House and the Senate, folks, they are paid equally. Remember I told you that they were equal in power, regardless of whether you serve in the House or in the Senate. Your base pay is at $174,000. Now that does not include per diem, that does not include any leadership or chairman leadership positions of committees. And if you look at the general public, folks, quite a stark difference. The average American, according to the 2010 census, individually makes $28,000 roughly dollars a year. The average household of 4 makes $53,000. Education, the House, folks, in terms of bachelor's degree, of the 435 members, have achieved their bachelor's, 94% of them. All 100 senators have their bachelor's and above. And if you look at the general public, those who are 25 years and older, I don't know if this is surprising to you. I think it should be that only less than 30%, at 28.8%, have attained their bachelor's. If you look at the breakdown in terms of gender, the House of the 435 members has 19% women, 20% in the Senate. Easy to do math in the Senate. There are 20 women in the Senate, and that is a record high for the chamber. So one out of every 5 senators is a woman. Generally speaking, the population is roughly about 51% women. Ethnicity, we're talking about percentage non-white, okay, non-ethnicity in terms of diversity here. Percent non-white. In the House of Representatives, we have 22% that are of different makeup of ethnicity. 7% of the Senate, so roughly 37% of the U.S. population are minorities. And I believe currently, right now, Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, and William Cowan, Democrat from Massachusetts, are the only African Americans to serve in the Senate. So given this, folks, I think it's pretty apparent, right? If you go back to the initial question I asked you to think about in the beginning of this lecture, does Congress represent the American people? If you look simply at these demographics, the answer would be no. Clearly, members of Congress are much older. They are much more affluent. They are much more educated, and they're white. And if you think about this, this question, if you think about these characteristics, and if I pose you the question, who do they look like of the people that we studied? I hope what comes to mind is that they look like the framers, right? Now, generally speaking, right? They're definitely much more white, affluent, educated. I'm going to talk much more about this in Unit 3 as well, but I think it's important for you to note that they also very much resemble likely voters. Likely voters, when we discuss voting patterns in Unit 3, tend to also be white, tend to be well-educated, tend to be affluent, homeowners, and such. That has some major implications in who, in fact, participates and doesn't participate in the political process. All right. Okay, all you have to do is, again, relax here and look at some maps. I gave you the numbers. I think looking at visuals provide a more striking picture of what in fact takes place. So if you look at this map of the United States, you really can't understand American politics if you don't know how to read the U.S. map in terms of geopolitics as well. Before I begin here, if I actually had my my red laser pointer, I just wanted to point out to you where Republicans and Democrats are at the map, where conservatives and liberals are. If you look at the West typically is a liberal Democratic bastion. We're looking at Washington, Oregon, and California. Democrats can also be found in the Northeast, in the New England area, as well as the Rust Belt states. Look at Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The Great Lakes states tend to also be, tends to lean a little bit more Democrat as well. Given that, where are all the Republicans and conservatives at? They tend to be the mountain states: Idaho, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Big Sky Country, right? The Dakotas, and then the Midwestern states as well, right? Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, and of course the South, right? Is where all the Republicans are at. So let me just show you again in pictures what we just talked about. This is again the 111th Congress. Again, we're looking at Congress from 2008 to 2010. And what you're seeing here is the senators' political party membership by state. And again, it's an easy map to read. If you have two Republicans, it's solidly red. By the way, if you don't know what GOP stands for, it's the Grand Old Party, another name for the Republican Party. If it's solidly blue, then you have two Democratic senators. If it's the color purple, then one of each. And as you can see, folks, this is very similar to the Electoral College results as well. Barack Obama won, not necessarily by a landslide in 2008, but clearly the Democrats won by a good amount in terms of electoral votes. Very similar here. And how are you supposed to read this? I would look at this map and think of the game Risk. Some of you folks may know that board game I'm referring to, right? It's the game of world domination, right? The objective of the game is for you to take over your opponent's territory and hold it. And in politics, it's the exact same thing. So given what I told you about where Democrats and Republicans are, you can see which states Democrats actually took away from the Republicans and to win not just both chambers in 2008, but also the presidency. And I'm looking at the states of Colorado and New Mexico. Those states tend to lean Republican. In 2008, they went Democrat. Colorado, I would say, went blue because the Democrats had their national convention. Your professor, myself, I was a delegate to that convention in Denver. That probably swung that state a little bit more left, and as such went Democrat that particular year. Virginia too, if you look at it, Virginia is a southern state. Virginia in 2008 voted for a Democrat in Barack Obama for the first time since Lyndon Baines Johnson back in '64. If you look at Arkansas, that's a little bit of an anomaly as well. It's a southern state. Why did it go blue? Well, that's Bill Clinton's home state. I'm not going to spend too much time here with the 112th Congress. As you can see, nothing really changed much. The Democrats still maintained control. And so is the 113th Congress. If you guys were curious about the striped green in Vermont and Maine, the green is where the independent senators are at. So let's move on to the 114th Congress. And here you finally got the election results from last year's midterm elections, and as you can see, the Republicans here took over, and you can see there's definitely much more red where you would expect the red to be, right? In the Great Plains states, the mountain states, the southern states as well. So again, that illustrates that, I think, quite poignantly, but not as poignantly as the U.S. House of Representatives. Here we go. Okay, so here's the 111th Congress, right? And the percent of House membership by state. And as you can see, this was from 2008 to 2010, the 111th Congress. It's, for the most part, it looks blue. How do you read this map? Well, if you look at the key there, if it's solidly red, then you definitely have Republicans. If it's solidly blue, then you have Democrats. And if you have slightly different shades of red and blue, then you could see which one has a slight majority. And so here you have the 111th Congress. Obama was elected. The country definitely was leaning much more liberal. And then, folks, President Obama introduced and made a priority universal health care. And he paid the price here, folks. And the reason why Republican/Libertarian/Tea Party activists were so upset with the Affordable Care Act was, again, hopefully by now you know, it mandates all of us to purchase health coverage. And Republicans, Libertarians, we haven't talked about ideology yet, but you'll see that they believe in freedom. And they believe that this is giving too much power to government. If government can compel us to purchase health coverage, what else can government do? And so they were extremely against the Affordable Care Act. And once it was in fact controversially passed through the legislative process, they came out in droves in the 2010 midterm elections. And you'll see the difference. Stare at that map here for a few seconds. As you can see, it's solidly blue. And I'll switch the slide here. Bam, there you go. I don't need to explain that. The Republicans, as you can see, took the majority away from the Democrats. Speaker Boehner assumed the speakership, and in a way, you've seen the Republicans have had control of the House ever since. If you look at the and if you look at the 114th Congress, as you can see, it was also there it is. Okay, so that's where we are today. In fact, 2 more slides here. So how is the U.S. Congress organized? Okay. Hint, hint. The U.S. Congress is organized by political parties. Okay. Even though George Washington said and cautioned the American people after his farewell address, do not form political parties. Ultimately, by the election of 1800, political parties were here to stay. And in a way, Washington was hypocritical by saying that, because he himself, remember, was a part of a political party. He was a Federalist. And what I want you to understand here, and I would write this down, because here's another important life lesson I want to share with you. I think it's fairly evident that we live at a time where there is hyperpartisanship, not just in Congress, but around the nation. We live in a divided nation. Democrats and Republicans don't seem to get along well. And in a way, it's one of the reasons why I left the California State Legislature, because I got tired of it. No longer are political parties willing to work each other. In fact, as I said, compromise has taken on a more negative connotation, that if you compromise, you give up your principles, when, again, I would argue that in order for the political process to work, you do need to have a give and take, and come to compromise. And in a way, I want to teach you this life lesson, because I think members of Congress have lost this idea, and rather than again coming to compromise, they tend to demonize each other, and they forgot this saying. This saying, here's the life lesson, is a saying from former Prime Minister of Great Britain, of the United Kingdom, Lord Palmerston. And Lord Palmerston said this: "There are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests." Now, let that sink in a moment. How is that related to politics? Let me repeat it again. There are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. Well, I think at the heart of that saying is to be nice, if you think about it, right? The lesson I think, is quite simple. You don't demonize the other side. You don't burn bridges. Why? As you'll work on your research brief number 2 in the legislative process, you'll find out that every stage of the process, for the most part, requires a majority vote. In the Constitution, it doesn't actually say you need the majority of one political party to move a bill forward, right? All you need is a simple majority. Lord Palmerston, I think, what he's hinting on is, again, this idea that you don't demonize the other side, because you don't know if you're there's no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. You don't know if that person across the aisle from that different political party, even though you may disagree with that person on this particular bill of that particular issue that day, you don't know if the following day he may become, your staunchest ally. So you can't have permanent friends. You cannot have permanent enemies in politics, because if you do, which I think most members of Congress do today, is they burn that bridge. And when you burn a bridge, it's not easily repaired, isn't it? It's easier to lose trust than to gain trust. That's an important life lesson as well, you guys, I think, for all of you to understand. It's important to build and keep your relationships, because you just never know, right? Whether or not you will need a favor from a friend, and you're not going to get that favor if you've had a falling away, right? It's very difficult to forget grudges. So I think it's important for me to pass along to you, again, a very important life lesson, not just in politics, but in life in general. Be nice, fulfill your promises, keep and build those relationships. Don't demonize the other side. Don't burn that bridge. At the end of the day, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. And lastly here, hierarchical leadership. Okay. Okay. Here's the House leadership. I just really want to point out a few things here that's going to be important for the exam and to your knowledge as well. That the Speaker of the House is the leader of the House. Remember, he's voted in by the majority of the members of the House. So of course, whichever political party has the majority, the Speaker will be a member of that political party. As you can see, in the House you both have majority and minority leaders, and you also have what's called our whips. Hint, hint, what are whips? Whips are typically the second or third, or sometimes even fourth ranking member of Congress, and they count votes. That's what they do. They ensure that their political party's rank and file vote along with their political party. And in a way, it's the opposite of what I just told you, right? About having no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, just permanent interests. What whips do is they, in a way, promote partisanship. All right, they play hardball, and this is something that I can't teach you, but I can, in a way, explain it to you. It's hard being a representative, because you are being influenced and pulled in many different directions. Let's say, for example, you're a member of Congress, you're a Democrat who is elected in a conservative district, for example, and let's say that you were going to vote for the Affordable Care Act. As a Democrat, the president is relying on you to vote for it. Your constituents are telling you don't vote for it. Well, that puts you in a rock and a hard place. And the majority whip, or the minority whips in general, can come up to you and say, and basically, if you tell them that you're not going to vote along with the party, they can threaten you and say, hey, if you don't vote with us, we're going to not support you in your next election, or we're not going to give you money, we're not going to provide you with campaign support. And that's the type of arm twisting that in fact happens. That's why politics, I think, which many other scholars also believe, it's an art. There's a style to leadership. There's a style to politics that in a way cannot be taught, but can only be learned through experience. We'll talk much more about committees later on, but I want you to note, this is going to help you for your research brief number 2, which I'll explain when I return, is that the House has a Rules Committee, and as such, they are much more formal than the Senate. Here you have the Senate leadership. The presiding officer is the one who controls the agenda, at least the agenda for that day, the order of business for that day. But the president of the Senate, hint hint, is the vice president. The Speaker pro tem, again, is the senior member or the dean of the Senate, but he really doesn't have, he or she, really doesn't have too much influence or clout. The majority leader in the Senate is really the one who's the equivalent of the Speaker of the House, who really directs the show. Okay, as you can see, there's whips, but again, what you'll see missing is that there's no Rules Committee in the Senate, and they in fact vote using an oral vote called unanimous consent, and I'll explain much more of that once we get to the legislative process. Okay, here's my last slide here. I know I went through a lot of information with you on this YouTube video, but I think this will again save us some time a little bit and allow us to save some time during the days that I would have had if I would have had you in the fall semester. So how is the U.S. Congress organized? They arrange themselves by committees, and there's 4 types of committees that I want you to know, and I'll define them for you here in this video. There's the Standing Committee, there's the Select/Special Committee, there's the Joint Committee, and the Conference Committee. The Standing Committee, ladies and gentlemen, are committees that are topical by nature. Okay, they're the ones that rarely change. Okay, there's a table in your textbook that shows you the types of committees each chamber has, and the Standing Committee are the committees again that are there. They're arranged by topics, like for example the Agricultural Committee, or the Transportation Committee, or the Judiciary Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, right? All of those are pretty much standard, and they rarely change. And in fact, I would say that a few of them are much more powerful than others. A Select/Special Committee is also an ad hoc committee. An ad hoc committee basically means that it is temporary in nature. A select committee is typically a committee that Congress puts together to investigate a very controversial issue. A good example of this would be shortly following 9/11, Congress put together the 9/11 Commission, and that was a select or special committee that was tasked to review why 9/11 occurred, and to provide recommendations to prevent another terrorist attack from happening. In fact, they published a book, the 9/11 Commission Report. Not too long ago, several years ago, you had the Simpson-Bowles Commission that attempted to address the national debt and how to reduce the national debt. Sometimes members of Congress can also put themselves in select committees. Just think about it this way: Congress puts these committees together to bring experts together so they can investigate an issue and provide recommendations. And once they're done with their task, in fact, that's another name for this committee, task force. Once they're done with their task, they dissolve, right? That's why they're ad hoc. Moving on. Joint committee, or joint committees, are committees that both chambers, in fact, have. For example, Homeland Security are of interest to both chambers, so they would, in fact, come together and have a joint committee. A conference committee is when, and you'll figure this out once you do your research brief number 2. In a way, I'm providing you hint, hint, one of the answers there. A conference committee is when two versions of the bill, the House version and the Senate version, pass, and again, these are the same versions of the bill, but there's differences in the bill. There's a House version that has been debated. There may be items there that are not the same from the Senate version of the bill. If there are these discrepancies, what Congress does is they convene, hint, hint, what's called a conference committee. And a conference committee, folks, is both a joint and a select committee. It's a joint committee because they are both made up of both House and Senate members, in fact, equal numbers. And they are a select committee because they have one task, and that is to reconcile the differences of that bill. And once they are done, that conference committee dissolves. So, disregard the My Poli Sci Lab activity. You are a member of Congress. You have a different one that you are doing, but also tied into the legislative process. You will be taking that My Poli Sci Lab. If not, if you haven't already done so. I will conclude the lecture here. I know I spent over an hour. Hopefully you learned a little bit about Congress, but this gives us the time here. It saves us some time in class and allows me to move forward. And when we return, I'm going to show you a little clip from one of my favorite movies, old black and white, in fact, called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Some of you folks may have seen it. And then we'll jumpstart the legislative process. So with that being said, do not forget to take your exam. It closes on Saturday, the 28th at midnight. Okay, and with that, I will sign off. I will see you folks on Monday, and we'll continue again looking at Congress, looking specifically at the legislative process. All right, have a great one. Have a great and safe weekend. We'll catch you later.